Welcome to my channel, The World of Science Fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Kalen stood on the gantry, and the cold was a physical thing. It was not the biting chill of open space, but the dead, recycled cold of the Gehenna penal colony, a sterility that seeped through the soles of his boots and into his bones. Below him, the processing floor gleamed under harsh lumen strips, a polished expanse of gray ferrocrete scarred by the drag marks of 1,000 forgotten souls. He had walked this gantry for 5 standard years, his gaze sweeping over the shorn heads and numbered jumpsuits, and in all that time, he had felt nothing but the slow erosion of his own humanity. Gehenna did not break men. It ground them down to dust, particle by silent particle. He had once been a soldier, a man who fought for ideals etched onto data slates and broadcast across the sector. He fought for the Alliance, for progress, for the neat, orderly expansion of their influence. Then he had seen what that progress cost. The worlds cracked open for their mineral wealth, the cultures extinguished for the sake of efficiency. The jagged scar that ran from his collarbone to his ribs was a souvenir from that life, a reminder that ideals were poor shields against plasma fire. Now he served the magnate corporation, a warden in a cage on a dead moon, and the only ideal he possessed was the sanctity of his next paycheck. The klaxon sounded, a flat, dissonant tone that announced a new arrival. The transport ship had docked an hour ago, a speck of darkness against the pockmarked face of Gehenna. From here, one could see the great curve of Ethel, the gas giant they orbited, its swirling bands of ochre and crimson a constant, majestic taunt of a beauty that could never be reached. The prisoners came from worlds like that, or worlds that orbited suns like distant embers, all of them brought here to dig for the xenocrystal that powered the Alliance's fleets and lined the magnate's vaults. Down on the floor, the heavy blast doors hissed open. 2 guards in standard gray armor prodded the new inmate forward. It was not a man. It was one of the Ethelans, the native species from the planet below. Kalen straightened, a flicker of something other than boredom stirring within him. They rarely got the natives. The corporation preferred to pacify them from orbit or leave them to their strange, silent lives in the planet's deep forests. To see one here, in chains, meant she had done something extraordinary. She was tall, impossibly slender, with skin the color of polished obsidian. Her hair was a shock of silver, cut short and ragged. She wore no jumpsuit, only the tattered remnants of her native clothing, bindings of woven fiber and leather. She did not stumble or shy away from the guards' prods. She walked with a liquid grace, her head held high, her gaze fixed on some point beyond the far wall of the processing chamber. Kalen zoomed in with his gantry optics. Her eyes were solid gold, without pupils or sclera, like pools of molten metal. They held a stillness that was unnerving, an ancient calm that had no place in this sterile, numbered hell. Warden Valerius stood on the opposite gantry, a monolith in his black, decorated uniform. He was a man carved from ambition and cruelty, his face a mask of pleasant disdain. Warden Kalen, his voice, amplified by the station's comms, was smooth as polished stone. Prepare the cleansing chamber. This one requires the full protocol. She is clankin, a direct descendant of their fire callers. Kalen's hand tightened on the gantry rail. The cleansing chamber. The official term was environmental acclimatization, but the inmates called it the trial by fire. It was a brutal test, a chamber where focused emitters simulated the heat of a star's corona, designed to break a new prisoner's will, to burn away their defiance and leave only a compliant shell. Most men screamed. Some begged. A few simply collapsed into a shuddering heap. No one endured it without being scarred, physically and spiritually. He keyed his calm, acknowledged, Warden, his voice was flat, betraying nothing. He had overseen dozens of such trials. It was part of the job, another routine act in a long list of soul-crushing duties. He turned and walked toward the control booth that overlooked the circular chamber set into the center of the floor, his heavy boots echoing in the metallic silence. The Ethelan was forced into the chamber. The thick, transparent plasteel door hissed shut behind her, sealing her in. She did not look at it. She stood in the center of the room, her back straight, her strange, golden eyes now closed. She looked less like a prisoner and more like a priestess at an altar. Initiate sequence, Valerius commanded. Kalen's fingers moved over the console, the muscle memory of his job taking over. He brought the core systems online. Power levels spiked, the air in the control booth humming with latent energy. On the screen, he saw the Ethelyn's biometric readings. Her heart rate was slow, steady. Her body temperature was already several degrees below human norm. He engaged the primary emitters. Inside the chamber, the air began to shimmer. Invisible waves of thermal energy poured from the walls, converging on the lone figure. Kalen watched her biometrics. Her temperature began to rise, but her heart rate remained placid. She did not flinch. She did not even sweat. A faint, silvery light began to emanate from her skin, a soft luminescence that seemed to push back against the oppressive heat. Valerius's voice crackled over the comm, increased to 70%. Let's see what this savage is made of. Kalen complied. The shimmering in the chamber intensified. The plasteel door began to creak under the thermal stress. The silver light around the Ethelyn woman brightened, but she remained still, a statue carved from night and starlight. Her biometrics were behaving erratically. Her core temperature was rising to dangerous levels, yet her metabolic rate was plummeting. It made no sense. It was as if her body was trying to freeze and burn at the same time. She is failing, Valerius said, a note of satisfaction in his tone. Her biology is incompatible with the trial. She will break. Kalen stared at the readings, and a cold certainty settled in his gut. Valerius was wrong. She was not failing the trial. The trial was failing her. Her species had not evolved under a yellow sun. They lived beneath the thick, storm-racked atmosphere of a gas giant, a world of deep pressures and strange energies. This raw, brute force heat was a poison to her physiology. She was not breaking. She was being cooked alive, her unique biology turning against itself in a desperate, losing battle. He could see it in the data feed, a cascade of cellular collapse. He looked from the data to the woman in the chamber. Her silver aura was flickering now, weakening. A tremor ran through her slender frame. For the first time, a flicker of something, pain, desperation, crossed her serene features. It was the look of a creature trapped, of a life being extinguished for no reason other than the casual cruelty of the system he served. And in that moment, something inside Kalen, a part of him he thought had been ground to dust long ago, refused to be silent. He remembered a village on Cygnus X-1, a place the Alliance had pacified because it stood in the way of a mining operation. He remembered the faces of the dead, faces that held the same quiet dignity he now saw in the Ethelyn woman. He had followed orders then. He had stood by and watched. Not again. His fingers flew across the console, but not to the shutdown sequence. That would be defiance, and Valerius would have him shot on the spot. He needed something else. A loophole. A piece of the bureaucratic machinery he could turn against its masters. He swiped away the emitter controls and pulled up the corporate colonial mandates, the vast, labyrinthine legal code that governed all their operations in unincorporated space. His mind raced, sifting through clauses and subsections, relics of a bygone era of exploration and conquest. "What are you doing, Kalen?" Valerius's voice was sharp, suspicious. "Shut down the diagnostic and focus on the trial." Kalen ignored him. His eyes scanned the archaic text. Protectorate agreements, resource claims, native populace integration protocols. Most of it was useless, legalese designed to justify exploitation. But there, buried deep in a forgotten addendum from the first expansion, was Clause 12. It was an old law, designed for colonists on hostile worlds, a way to claim a native individual as a ward, a spouse, or property, placing them under the direct protection and control of an Alliance citizen. It was a vile, possessive piece of legislation, a tool of empire. But it had never been rescinded, and it superseded local mandate in matters of personal security. He looked at the woman, whose light was now almost gone. She was sinking to her knees, her body convulsing. He had seconds. "Warden Valerius," Kalen said, his voice steady, amplified through the comms for the entire processing floor to hear. "Pursuant to the Alliance colonial mandates, Addendum 4, Clause 12, I am invoking Protector's Law." There was a stunned silence. Even the hum of the emitters seemed to falter. Valerius's voice, when it came, was laced with disbelief and fury. "What did you say?" "I am claiming the prisoner as my ward." Kalen stated, his finger hovering over the override command that would legally register the act. Under the terms of a spousal contract, she is now under my protection. The trial is terminated. He slammed his finger down on the console. The red light of the emitters died. The humming ceased. An emergency system override klaxon began to blare, a far more urgent and piercing sound than the arrival tone. On the floor below, guards snapped their rifles up, aiming them at the control booth. Across the gantry, Warden Valerius's face was a mask of pure rage. Kalen had not just disobeyed an order. He had challenged the warden's absolute authority, using the system's own archaic rules against it. He had thrown a stone into the perfectly calibrated machine of Gehenna, and the machine was already beginning to scream. The immediate consequence was chaos. Red emergency lighting bathed the processing center in a hellish glow, strobing across the armored forms of the guards as they converged on the control booth. The override klaxon was a physical assault, a shriek that vibrated through the deck plates. Kalen knew he had only moments before the door behind him was breached. Valerius's voice boomed over the station-wide comm, no longer smooth but a raw, furious command. Sub-Warden Kale, seal all sectors. The prisoner and Warden Kalen are designated hostiles. Subdue and contain. Lethal force is authorized. Kalen didn't hesitate. He smashed the emergency release panel next to the console, and the plasteel window overlooking the chamber fractured into a spiderweb of cracks. He kicked it once, twice, and the weakened material gave way, shattering onto the floor below. He vaulted through the opening, landing in a crouch inside the now-cooling cleansing chamber. The air was still thick with the smell of ozone and something else, something alien and floral, like burnt incense. The ethylene woman was on her knees, her head bowed, her silver hair spilling over her shoulders. She was trembling, not from fear, but from the aftershocks of the thermal assault. The silvery light that had protected her was gone, and her dark skin was now marred with faint, shimmering patches that looked like heat blisters made of crystal. He moved toward her, his hand outstretched. "We have to go?" Now, her head snapped up, those solid gold eyes fixed on him, and for the first time, he saw not ancient calm, but a burning, intelligent fire. There was no gratitude in her gaze, only a deep, penetrating assessment. She did not know what he had done, only that the pain had stopped, and he was the cause. She rose to her feet with a fluid motion, her height surprising him. She stood a full head taller than him, a being of impossible grace even in her weakened state. The chamber door behind them was sealed, but the one leading deeper into the processing sublevels was a standard pressure door. Kalen keyed the manual release beside it. As the door hissed open, the first plasma bolts from the guards on the gantry struck the plasteel where they had just been standing, leaving molten craters. They plunged into the maintenance corridor beyond. Here, the polished sterility of the prison gave way to raw functionality. Pipes and conduits lined the walls, slick with condensation. The air was thick with the hum of the station's life support. It was a maze, but it was a maze Kalen knew better than anyone. For 5 years, his boredom had driven him to study the station schematics, tracing every conduit, every ventilation shaft, every forgotten access tunnel. His encyclopedic knowledge, once a cure for ennui, was now their only chance of survival. "This way," he said, his voice low and urgent. He didn't know if she understood his words, but she followed his lead without question. Her movements were unervingly silent. While his heavy boots clanged on the metal grating, her bare feet made no sound at all. She moved like a shadow, a creature of the deep forest transplanted into this metal tomb. They ran, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind them, the shouts of guards, the heavy thud of maglocked boots. Kalen's mind worked with a clarity he hadn't felt since his days on the battlefield. He was no longer a numb functionary. He was a soldier again, with a mission. The mission was simple: survive. Their alliance was one of pure necessity. He had the knowledge, she had something else. He didn't know what. He had seen the silver light, the impossible resistance to the heat. She was more than just a primitive tribeswoman. He glanced back at her as they rounded a corner. Her golden eyes were constantly scanning, not just the path ahead, but the walls, the ceiling, the very air around them. She seemed to be sensing things he could not, her head tilting as if listening to a sound beyond his hearing. They came to a junction. To the left was the path to the lower docking bays, the most obvious escape route and undoubtedly the most heavily guarded. To the right was a service shaft that led down to the primary power conduits, a dangerous and volatile section of the station. It was their only real option. As they headed right, a squad of guards appeared at the far end of the corridor, led by a man with a cruel, pinched face and the insignia of a sub-warden on his collar. It was Kale, Valerius's attack dog, a man who relished his work. "There they are," he yelled, raising his plasma rifle. Kalen shoved the Ethelyn woman behind him and returned fire with his service pistol. The weapon was a pea shooter compared to their rifles, its energy bolts dissipating against their body armor. He was buying seconds, nothing more. A red bolt seared past his head, striking a steam pipe on the wall. Hot vapor filled the corridor, obscuring their vision. He was outmatched and he knew it. Kale and his men advanced through the steam, their forms like specters in the mist. Kalen fired his last shot and braced for the impact. This was it, a short, pointless rebellion, ending in a maintenance corridor on a forgotten moon. But the killing shot never came. The Ethelyn woman moved. She stepped in front of him, her slender arm raised, her palm facing the advancing guards. The air in front of her seemed to solidify, to warp and bend. The silvery light flared from her skin again, but this time it was not a soft aura. It was a focused, blinding shield. The guards' plasma bolts struck the invisible barrier and splashed off it like water, their energy dissipating harmlessly. Kale's squad stopped, their surprise evident even through their helmeted visors. They fired again, a volley of concentrated energy, and the shield held. The Ethelyn woman did not even flinch. A low hum emanated from her, a sound that resonated deep in Kalen's chest. Then, she closed her hand into a fist. The metal deck plates at the guard's feet buckled and tore upward, twisting into a gnarled wall of steel. The conduit pipes on the walls ruptured, spraying the guards with supercooled gas and scalding steam. They were thrown back, their formations broken, their armor crackling with frost and heat damage. They were not dead, but they were disabled, trapped in a cage of the station's own making. The woman lowered her arm, the silver light fading. She swayed, a hand going to the wall to steady herself. The effort had cost her. She looked at Kalen, and this time, her golden eyes held a new light. It was not gratitude, not yet. It was acknowledgement. He had shielded her with his body and a forgotten law. She had shielded him with a power he could not comprehend. A pact had been made, not in words, but in a shared moment of violence and survival. They were no longer just a warden and his prisoner. They were allies. They left Kale and his squad in the ruined corridor and descended into the service shaft. The air grew hotter, thick with the smell of ionized particles and heated metal. The constant, deep hum of the station's primary reactor vibrated through the ladder rungs in Kalen's hands. Below them lay a cavernous chamber filled with colossal energy conduits, each one thick as an ancient tree, pulsing with a faint blue light. This was the heart of Gehenna, the source of all its power. It was also their only path to the surface. The journey was a shared ordeal. They navigated the treacherous gantries that crisscrossed the reactor chamber, the heat from the conduits making the air shimmer. They moved through darkened, forgotten storage bays filled with derelict mining equipment, ghosts of steel and rust. They crawled through ventilation ducts so tight Kalen had to shed his warden's jacket, the rough metal scraping his back. Through it all, the Ethelyn, who he had begun to think of as Lyra, a name he'd seen on her processing file, a placeholder assigned by the corporation, moved with that same impossible silence and grace. She was weak. The exertion of her power had drained her, and the lingering effects of the cleansing chamber were still evident. The crystalline blisters on her skin seemed to pulse with a faint, sick light. Yet, she never faltered. When they had to cross a wide chasm on a narrow, precarious beam, she walked it as if it were a forest path. When Kalen's foot slipped, her hand shot out, her grip surprisingly strong, and steadied him. They found a small, pressurized maintenance locker, barely large enough for two people, and sealed the door. For the first time in hours, they were safe from immediate pursuit. The only sound was the distant thrum of the station and their own breathing. They had a single oxygen tank Kalen had grabbed from an emergency cache and 2 nutrient paste packets. It was not much. Kaelin offered her one of the packets. She looked at the gray tube, then at him, her golden eyes unreadable. She took it, but did not eat. Instead, she reached out and gently touched the jagged scar on his chest, her fingers tracing its path through the fabric of his shirt. Her touch was cool, inquisitive. It was not a human gesture, yet the intent was clear. She was asking a question. He found himself answering, his voice rough in the confined space. The Alliance liberation of the Cygnus sector. A piece of shrapnel from a separatist bomber. He didn't know why he told her. He hadn't spoken of it in years. But in her silent, alien presence, the words came unbidden. She tilted her head, then lowered her hand. She turned slightly, presenting her back to him. The tattered fabric of her clothing had been burned away in places, and across the obsidian skin of her shoulders was a pattern of scars unlike anything he had ever seen. They were not jagged and chaotic like his. They were intricate, geometric, like the patterns of frost on a window pane, or the crystalline structure of a mineral. They were beautiful and terrible at the same time. Ritual scars, or perhaps the marks of her clan, the Firecallers. He understood. He had his scars from a war of metal and plasma. She had hers from a world of ritual and power he could not imagine. They were both survivors, marked by the fires of their past. It was a moment of profound connection, forged in silence and the shared language of pain. She finally broke the seal on the nutrient paste and ate, her movements slow and deliberate. When she was done, she closed her eyes and placed a hand against the cold metal wall of the locker. A faint silver light pulsed from her palm, and the deep thrum of the station seemed to change in pitch, to resonate with the light she was emitting. And then, his mind was filled with images. It was not a voice, not a thought, but a direct transmission of experience. He saw a world, Ethel, not as the swirling gas giant he knew, but from its surface. He saw colossal, phosphorescent forests under a sky of roiling crimson clouds. He saw her people, tall and graceful, living in cities woven from the living wood of the giant trees. He felt their deep, symbiotic connection to the planet, a bond that was psychic, biological, spiritual. Then he saw the moon, Gehenna, hanging in the sky. It was not a dead rock. It was a sacred place, a singing stone that amplified the planet's life force, regulating its violent weather patterns and nurturing the psychic bond of its people. It was the heart of their world, and they were its guardians. The vision shifted. He saw the magnate corporation's ships arrive, great, ugly wedges of metal that tore at the moon's surface. He saw the deep drills biting into the sacred rock, extracting the xenocrystals. He felt the pain of the moon, a discordant, agonizing shriek that echoed across the planet below. The crystals were not just minerals. They were the moon's crystallized life essence, the solidified music of its song. The mining was not just extraction, it was vivisection. He saw the storms on Ethel grow more violent, the forests begin to wither, the psychic bond of her people fraying and breaking. He saw her clan, the Firecallers, attempting to fight back, using their power to disrupt the mining operations. They were not primitives attacking a superior force. They were doctors trying to save their patient from a parasite. He saw Lyra leading a raid on a mining outpost, not to kill, but to try and heal the wound in the moon's crust. That was how she had been captured. The final image burned into his mind. Warden Valerius, standing over a holographic display of the moon, his face alight with greedy satisfaction. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew he was killing a world, and he did not care. The xenocrystals were too valuable, the profits too immense. The complete destruction of Ethel was not a tragedy to him. It was an acceptable operational cost. The vision faded. Kaelin was back in the cramped locker, gasping for air, the metal wall cold against his back. He looked at Lyra. Her eyes were open, watching him. She had shown him the truth. This was not about a prison break. It was not about his insubordination. It was about genocide, committed out of pure, calculated avarice. His small act of defiance, his invocation of an old law to save one life, had thrust him into the center of a war for the soul of a world. The weariness and cynicism he had carried for years felt like a hollow, shameful thing. He finally had a cause again, and the thought was terrifying. They made their way to the surface through an exhaust port, emerging into the cold, silent vacuum of Gehenna. The moon's surface was a landscape of gray dust and jagged, black rock, a monochrome nightmare under the distant light of a star. Above them, the swirling, majestic face of Ethel filled half the sky, a constant reminder of what was at stake. They had scavenged 2 environment suits from the maintenance locker, old, patched models that would not last long. The oxygen indicators on their wrists were already ticking down. Their destination was a remote communications relay on the far side of a deep canyon, an automated facility that had been abandoned years ago. Kalen knew it was their only chance. If he could get the station's long-range transmitter online, he could bypass Magnate's comms blackout and send Lyra's story, the truth, to the Alliance. It was a slim hope. The Alliance was often deaf to the crimes of its corporate partners, but it was the only hope they had. Pursuit was not far behind. Looking back, Kalen could see the lights of skimmers sweeping across the lunar surface, their search beams cutting sharp cones through the darkness. Kale would be leading them, his fury no doubt honed to a razor's edge by his humiliation in the maintenance corridor. They had to move fast. The journey was brutal. The low gravity made each step a bounding leap, but it was treacherous. The ground was covered in a fine, abrasive dust that threatened to clog the seals of their suits, and the rocks were sharp as obsidian knives. They moved in silence, communicating through simple hand gestures, 2 fragile figures against an immense, hostile landscape. Valerius, unwilling to wait for Kale's ground teams, escalated his attack. A heavy transport ship detached from the main station, descending from orbit and settling on a landing pad near the prison complex. From its belly deployed not just more skimmers, but 3 heavily armored ground crawlers, war machines designed for planetary assaults. They began to rumble across the plains, their destination clear, the abandoned comms relay. Valerius wasn't just trying to catch them. He was moving to cut off their only avenue of escape or communication. They reached the edge of the canyon. It was a vast, dark chasm, miles wide, plunging into the moon's depths. The relay station was visible on the other side, a lonely spire of metal against the star-dusted blackness. A narrow maintenance bridge, little more than a skeletal framework of steel, spanned the abyss. It was their only way across. As they stepped onto the bridge, the ground crawlers crested a nearby ridge. Their forward cannons swiveled and locked onto the fragile structure. The first shells screamed past, impacting the canyon wall in a silent explosion of rock and dust. Kalen grabbed Lyra's arm, pulling her forward. "Run," he yelled, his voice tinny and distant in his helmet's calm. They sprinted across the bridge, the metal plates vibrating under their feet. Another shell hit one of the bridge's support pylons. The entire structure shuddered violently, groaning in protest. Kalen risked a glance back. The crawlers were closing in, relentless and implacable. Kale's skimmers were fanning out, moving to cut them off on the other side. They were caught in a perfectly executed pincer movement. They were halfway across when a shell scored a direct hit on the section of bridge just behind them. The metal tore with a screech that vibrated through the soles of their boots. The bridge sagged, its structural integrity failing. Ahead of them, the far end of the bridge began to pull away from the canyon's edge. They were not going to make it. In that moment of desperation, Lyra acted. She pushed past Kalen, her movements impossibly fast even in the bulky suit. She ran to the very edge of the collapsing section, to the point of greatest stress. She knelt, placing her gloved hands on the groaning metal plate. The silver light flared around her, brighter than ever before, a miniature star in the lunar darkness. It flowed from her hands into the bridge itself. The tortured metal did not just stabilize, it began to change. The torn edges flowed like liquid, reknitting themselves. The buckling supports straightened, reinforced by a glowing, crystalline lattice that spread from her hands like frost. She was not just holding the bridge together, she was remaking it, infusing the dead steel with her own life force. Kalen could only stare in awe. The crawlers continued their bombardment, but the shells that struck the bridge now glanced off the glowing, crystalline sections, their explosive force useless against her power. She held the bridge together long enough for them to cross, her body rigid with effort. They scrambled onto the solid ground of the far side just as the light from her hands faded. The crystalline lattice dissolved, and with a final, agonizing groan, The entire bridge tore free from its moorings and plunged into the blackness of the canyon below, taking their only path of retreat with it. Lyra collapsed, her suit's systems flashing red alerts. Kalen dragged her behind the relative cover of the comms relay's foundation. He checked her suit's monitor. Her life signs were dangerously low. She had poured almost everything she had into that one desperate act. But they had made it. They were at the relay. The crawlers were trapped on the other side of the canyon. Kale's skimmers, however, were already crossing the chasm further down, their engines glowing like angry eyes in the dark. They had bought themselves time, but not much. It became brutally clear, as Kalen worked frantically to power up the relay's transmitter, that their small victory was meaningless in the grand scheme. From the relay's high vantage point, he could see the magnate operation on the moon's surface in its terrifying entirety. Massive mining machines, like titanic insects, were converging on the primary excavation site. And in orbit, Valerius's command ship was moving into a new position, its ventral hull glowing with stored energy. Lyra, leaning weakly against the wall, pointed a trembling finger toward the command ship. Again, the visions flooded Kalen's mind, sharper and more frantic this time. She showed him Valerius's final plan. It was not just about mining anymore. The slow extraction was too inefficient. He was going to use a synchronized deep core detonation, a series of seismic charges planted at the heart of the mine. The blast would shatter a quarter of the moon, releasing a massive, easily harvested cloud of xenocrystal dust. It was a final, brutal act of planetary butchery, and it was scheduled to happen in less than an hour. Sending a message to the Alliance was pointless. It would arrive too late, if it was ever heard at all. They could not fight the crawlers, the skimmers, and the entire station garrison. They could not stop the detonation from their remote outpost. There was no military solution. The war was unwinnable. The sheer scale of Valerius's power was absolute, his cruelty matched only by his efficiency. He would crack the moon, kill a world, and be celebrated for the record profits he would deliver. Despair settled over Kalen, cold and heavy as the lunar dust. He had fought, he had run, he had defied a tyrant, all for nothing. He had brought this strange, powerful woman to this lonely place only to watch her world die. He slumped against the console, the relay's power-up sequence seeming like a pointless joke. He looked at Lyra. Her helmet was off now, her silver hair stark against the black sky. Her golden eyes were fixed on the great, swirling face of Ethel. There was no despair in her gaze, only a profound, heartbreaking sorrow. She looked back at him and placed her hand on the central console of the comms relay. It was not a random gesture. The console was connected to the deep-level seismic sensors that monitored the moon's stability. The screen flickered to life, displaying a complex, three-dimensional map of Gehenna's interior. At its very center, a single point of light pulsed, faint but steady. The moon's core. And then she showed him the final truth. She showed him the impossible choice. Her people had a legend, a final protocol for a time of great crisis. The moon, the singing stone, was not just a passive amplifier. It was a vessel. A consciousness could merge with the core, becoming one with the moon itself. The merged being would become its new heart, its new mind. From within, they could stabilize it, severing the harmonic connection that was killing Ethel. More than that, they could unleash the moon's own resonant frequency in a single, controlled pulse. A wave of pure energy precisely tuned to disrupt the complex technologies of the outsiders, rendering their ships and weapons inert. It would be a final, perfect defense. But the sacrifice was absolute. The individual would cease to be. Their mind, their memories, their very soul would be subsumed, becoming the eternal, silent, unthinking consciousness of the moon. They would be a guardian, but also a prisoner in a cage of rock and crystal for all time. The solution was there. A way to end it all. A way to save her world. But it required a sacrifice beyond comprehension. Kalen stared at the schematic, at the pulsing light that represented the moon's core. He looked at Lyra, at her exhausted, determined face. She was not asking him to do it. She was telling him that this was the only way, and it was a path she was prepared to walk herself. She, the last of the fire callers, would become the final guardian. But he could not let her. She was the future of her people, the one who held their history, their power. He was nothing. A disgraced warden, a burnt-out soldier with a past full of ghosts and a future that promised only a continuation of the same weary existence. His life was a ledger of failures and compromises. Her life was a sacred trust. He thought of the village on Cygnus X1. He thought of the years spent watching souls be ground to dust on Gehenna. He had spent his life serving systems that took, that broke, that consumed. Here, finally, was a chance to build something, to protect, to give. His decision was not a flash of heroic inspiration. It was a slow, quiet settling, like dust on a windless plain. It was the only choice that made any sense. His life had been a long, slow walk toward this single, meaningful moment. To sacrifice an empty future for a world full of life was not a loss. It was a bargain, the best one he had ever been offered. He stood up, his body aching from the chase and the fight. He looked at Lyra, and the internal deliberation was over. There was no more conflict within him, only a calm, cold certainty. He had spent his life running from responsibility, from commitment, from any cause that might demand something of him. The running stopped here. He didn't need to make a speech. Words were insufficient for what needed to be said, for the magnitude of the choice. He simply walked to the relay's main control panel, the one linked to the seismic sensors. He keyed in a command, rerouting the sensor access to the main mining facility's deep core drill controls. The schematics on the screen shifted, showing the central spire of the mining operation, the massive drill that now reached almost to the moon's core. It was designed to deliver the seismic charges. It could also be used to deliver a different kind of payload. Then, he turned to face her. He reached up and touched the side of her helmet, a gesture of profound finality. He looked into her solid gold eyes and gave a single, slow nod. Understanding dawned in her expression, followed by a wave of protest. She shook her head, her eyes widening. She reached for him, to stop him, to argue. This was her sacrifice to make, her duty. He gently took her hand and pushed it away. "You have a world to save," he said, his voice quiet but firm in the calm. "I just have a debt to pay." She stared at him, her lips parted. The protest died in her eyes, replaced by an expression of immense sorrow, and something deeper, a look of profound, heartbreaking respect. She saw the resolve in him, the peace that had settled over him. She understood that his mind was made. She lowered her hand and gave a slow, reluctant nod of her own. She accepted his choice. In the silence of the dead moon, under the gaze of her dying world, they sealed their pact. The man with no future would give everything for a people he had only just met, and the woman who was their last hope would have to live with the cost of his sacrifice. Their path back was not one of stealth, but of brutal, direct assault. They had to return to the source, to the heart of the magnate operation, the primary excavation site. Kale's skimmers were already swarming the relay station, laying down suppressing fire. The final confrontation had to be at the core chamber, the industrial cathedral where Valerius was overseeing the placement of the final deep core charges. Lyra, seeming to draw strength from his resolve, led the way. She no longer shielded or deflected. She attacked. With a sweep of her hand, she tore a jagged fissure in the lunar surface, swallowing one of the attacking skimmers whole. With another, she ripped the cannon from a second skimmer and turned it back on its allies. She was no longer just a protector. She was a storm, a whirlwind of focused power, clearing a path for him. Kalen fought with a soldier's grim efficiency. He provided covering fire, called out targets, his tactical knowledge a perfect complement to her raw power. They moved as one, a seamless unit of human strategy and alien might, cutting a swath through Kale's forces. They hijacked one of the last remaining skimmers and raced across the gray plains toward the glowing, incandescent wound of the central mine. The core chamber was a vast, man-made cavern deep beneath the surface, lit by the hellish glare of industrial lamps and the pulsing energy of the colossal mining drill. The drill spire was a pillar of black metal that descended from the cavern's ceiling, its tip hovering just above the final layer of rock that separated them from the moon's core. Warden Valerius stood on a command platform near the spire, flanked by his elite Praetorian guards, his face illuminated by the holographic timer counting down to detonation. He turned as their stolen skimmer crashed through the chamber's pressure doors. A flicker of annoyance crossed his features, but no fear. So, the warden and his pet decided to return, he said, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. A futile gesture. You are too late to stop anything. I'm not here to stop it, Kalen yelled back as he leapt from the skimmer, his pistol already firing. I'm here to change the outcome. The final battle began. Lyra engaged the Praetorian guards, her power a maelstrom of telekinetic force. Slabs of ferrocrete ripped from the floor, flying like missiles. The guards' plasma fire sizzled and dissipated against her shimmering shields. She was a singular, unstoppable force, a goddess of wrath holding back the tide of armored men, buying him the time he needed. Kalen ignored the chaos of the battle. He had only one objective. He sprinted for the drill spire, dodging plasma bolts and flying debris. He reached the base of the massive structure and slammed his hand on the access panel. He was not a technician, but he had studied the schematics. He knew what he had to do. It was not a simple button press. The system required a biosignature, a conscious mind to guide the final, delicate process of interfacing with the moon's core. The machine was designed to deliver a payload of explosives, but its energy conduits could be repurposed. He overrode the safety protocols, forcing the system to recognize him as the payload. He climbed onto the maintenance cradle that encircled the spire and began the final sequence. A series of thick cables, crackling with blue energy, snaked out from the spire and attached themselves to his body, piercing his suit and his skin. The pain was excruciating, a fire that burned along every nerve. He grit his teeth, his vision turning red at the edges. He looked across the chamber. Lyra was faltering. Her power, immense as it was finite. She was bleeding from a dozen small cuts, her movements growing slower. Valerius watched her, a cruel smile on his face, waiting for her to exhaust herself. She met Kalen's gaze, her golden eyes wide with desperation and sorrow. This was it. Kalen took a deep breath and initiated the final command. The process of becoming began. It was not a gentle merging. It was a violent, agonizing dissolution of self. His consciousness was ripped from his body, siphoned through the cables and into the drill spire. He felt his thoughts, his memories, his very identity being shredded into a billion pieces of raw data and energy. He saw his life flash before him. The fires of Cygnus, the gray years on Gehenna, the moment he had first seen her in the cleansing chamber. It was all stripped away, burned clean by the sheer, overwhelming power of the machine. He screamed, but he had no mouth. The pain was absolute, a universe of pure sensation without a mind to process it. He was the machine. He was the energy flowing through the conduits. He was the drill bit lowering into the heart of the moon. Then he touched the core, and the pain stopped. He was no longer Kalen. He was something else. He was vast, ancient, and silent. He was the rock, the crystal, the cold, dark heart of the moon. His consciousness spread through the entire celestial body in an instant, a silent awakening after a billion years of slumber. He felt the wounds of the mining, the scars left by the magnate's drills, as if they were cuts on his own skin. He felt the dying world of Ethel, its weak pulse a faint echo across the void. And he felt the alien technology infesting his surface, a parasitic infection that had to be cleansed. With a single, silent thought, he acted. A wave of pure, resonant energy emanated from the moon. It was not an explosion. It was not destructive. It was a perfect, silent counterfrequency, the song of the moon itself, amplified into a cleansing pulse. In the core chamber, the harsh industrial lights flickered and died. The hum of the drill spire ceased. The plasma rifles in the Praetorians' hands went inert, becoming useless lumps of metal. Across the system, the effect was absolute. The engines of Valerius's command ship went silent. The lights on its bridge went dark. The deep core charges, moments from detonation, were rendered harmless. Every piece of magnate technology, from the ground crawlers to the individual guards' comm units, was instantly and permanently disabled. The war did not end in a blaze of glory. It simply stopped. In the sudden, profound silence and darkness of the core chamber, broken only by the faint, majestic light of Ethel filtering from above, Valerius stood powerless. He was a tyrant on a dead throne, a king in a tomb of his own silent, useless machines. Lyra, her strength returning in the sudden absence of the technological interference, simply watched him, her golden eyes the only source of light on the command platform. His empire had crumbled in a single, silent moment. 10 years passed. The world of Ethel flourished under its crimson sky. The violent storms had subsided, replaced by a gentle, life-giving climate. The phosphorescent forests had healed, their soft light once again stretching to the clouds. The people of Ethel had re-established their psychic bond, their culture revitalized, their future secured. The magnate corporation, crippled by the catastrophic loss of its Gehenna operation and exposed by the data Kalen had managed to partially transmit before his sacrifice, had been broken by the Alliance, its assets seized, its executives tried for crimes against sentient life. The system was at peace, the memory of the corporation's greed a cautionary tale told to the young. Lyra stood on the highest branch of a city tree, looking up at the night sky. She was no longer a lone warrior, but a leader, a guide for her people in this new era of peace and cautious exploration. In the sky above, beside the swirling bands of their gas giant, hung the moon. To the first contact teams from the Alliance, it was designated Gehenna, a barren, worthless rock, its xenocrystal deposits mysteriously rendered inert. They saw a dead moon and left it alone. But Lyra saw something else. She saw him. He was not dead, but he was not alive. He was the guardian. His consciousness was the silent, steady hand that kept the moon in its perfect orbit, that shielded her world from harm. He was the quiet hum beneath the surface, the eternal watcher in the dark. His sacrifice was the bedrock upon which their new world was built, a peace paid for with a single human soul. She reached into a pouch at her side and drew out a small, smooth stone of gray, lunar rock, a piece she had taken from the core chamber before she left. She held it in her palm, its cold surface a tangible link to the man who had given everything. She did not weep. Her people did not express grief in such a way. Instead, she sent a single thought out into the void, a feeling of profound, unending gratitude, a silent promise that he would not be forgotten. Up on the moon, in the cold, silent dark, a single, faint pulse of silver light emanated from deep within the rock, a fleeting acknowledgement across the gulf of space. A silent echo of a promise kept,